This is Jerry Mashesky with Balance Community Slackline Outfitters. Today we're going to be talking about taping a Highline from start to finish with some fun tips and cool ways to speed up the process. Let's jump right into it. Alright, so the first thing you want to do when you're getting ready to tape is to set up your taping area. If you're in a dirty area or a place with maybe cars have parked there or something, you're going to want to find a tarp or lay something on the ground before you start taping or flaking your line. And if you are in one of those areas, it's important to keep your line completely on the tarp or whatever you put on the ground, because there can be harmful chemicals on places where autos have been. You can check out our webbing guidelines for more information on that. So the line we're working with today is an Arrow 2 prototype, very similar to Arrow 1 prototype. And we have sewn loops on both ends. The line itself, the webbing, is about 140 feet long, about 42 meters or so. And we're going to fold it in half to use as main and backup. And so this particular webbing, it's colored differently on both edges. And so if I get to the middle and just simply fold it in half like this, the one edge on both the main and the backup will be the same color, same as the other edge. And that's important for detecting twists on the line. If we were to put a half twist in the middle and tape it such that blue on the main and orange on the backup is opposite of the backup line, it's going to be hard to tell if there's twists in the line. So it's important to match those colors. And that works similarly with a webbing that has different colored faces, like Arrow 2. For instance, Arrow 2 has orange edges on one face and blue edges on the other. If we fold it just in half in the middle, we're going to have blue on both the main and the backup. So it's going to be really hard to see a twist when you're looking down the length of the line. And so when you have opposite colored faces instead of edges, you're going to want to put a half twist in that line in the middle when you're taping a single piece. Or if you have two pieces, just make sure that they're facing the same direction, blue up in this case, and on both lines. See, if we have a half twist there, it's blue on one side and orange on the other. That's much, much easier to detect a twist along the length. So now we have our single piece, and as I mentioned before, we were working with sewn loops here. And so an important note to make about the sewn loops is when we rig the line, we're going to want our sewn loops to stack like this, such that the main line has the additional layers on the top, especially if you're using these cascading sewn loops. And then the backup is on the bottom, just like that. And so when we find the middle, we want to make sure that we have the right piece on top, such that when we tape, it ends up like this, rather than like that, where the excess, the two backup loops are in between the two lines rather than on top and on bottom, because this is going to be way easier to work with. So knowing that, we can now flake this out, starting at the sewn loops. We know we want it in this orientation, and so we'll put our finger in the middle as we flake and find the middle of this webbing. So when you're flaking through that, you don't worry about twists, because you'll have to fix them when you get to the end anyway. But now we're at the middle point, and you still have your finger in the middle because you know you want this piece on the top. So we'll just fix all the twists there and put a knot. Just like that. And now we'll reflake it, making sure everything stays on the tarp here. And this time we're going to make sure it stays flat, both the main and the backup lines, going to the other end. And then when you get to the end, what I like to do is form a knot. Keeping everything flat so you don't lose your orientation there. leave enough room there so you can fit a tape on one side of the knot, and then once that tape is on, you can undo this knot. If you have time to put a tape on there instead of a knot, that also works. But the reason why we want to flake our webbing ahead of time and not do it while we're taping the line is it saves a ton of time. If you're working with twists, trying to get everything flat while you're taping, it often doubles or even triples the length of time it takes to tape a line. Having a nice flat line ready to go while you're taping makes everything much, much smoother. All right, so now that we have our line flaked, folded in half properly with the ends easily accessible, we can start taping. Now, as I mentioned before, this line is 140 feet long, so I can rig maybe a 60-foot high line with this. Knowing that, we should probably stick with between 3 to 5 foot or 1 to 1.5 meter tape spacings. And as mentioned in previous articles, we want to keep that as random as possible. And so I'm going to vary that 1 meter, 1.5, 1.2 meters, 1 meter, you know, just as random as you can get it. And for this particular length, we don't need a section of the line to be tighter tape spacings. As mentioned, the trick zone. We won't need that on this length, but if you're planning to rig 100 meters or a 70 meter or whatever, a line that you plan to spend some significant amount of time in the middle, try to build in a trick zone while you're taping. So knowing that we're going to have an average of about 1.2 meter of tape spacing between each tape on this whole line, and it's about an 18 meter maximum distance, that means we're going to need about 12 tapes to fully tape this line. So what I like to do is find a nice metal surface. This hand truck works well for me. Situate it in front of the spot where you're going to be taping and get your tape roll ready. I'm using fiber reinforced tape for this, my new favorite. And then pre-measure your 12 tapes or however many you're going to need. And to find that out, just take the average tape spacing that you're going to use and multiply it by the length. And or divide the length by the average tape spacing, and that should be the number of tapes you need. 18 meters divided by 1.5 meters, 12 tapes. So pre-measure and cut all your tapes. All right, so now we got 12 tapes pre-measured, and now we need to decide what kind of tapes we're going to be using, what style of taping. I like to do main or backup sliders on majority of lines these days, just because they're super strong, they don't fall completely off. There's just a description of different styles of taping in the link right there. Yeah, so let's do backup sliders on this particular line. And with this style of webbing with the different colored edges, it doesn't really matter which side is up. But with some webbings with different colored faces, it's maybe important to you which side is up. And so decide that before you start taping, and then it makes the whole process easier. Since we're doing backup sliders, we're going to have the backup be the top line while we're taping, just because it makes things a lot easier. So the first tape, I like to do about, 3 inches from the end of the sewn loop, or 75 millimeters. That's pretty close there to allow a minute amount of movement or sliding possibility. But yeah, it keeps the ends together really well, which is a nice feature to have in your taped line. So do your first tape. And then what I like to do, it helps with the rigging process and for communication while you're rigging with a partner, maybe on a huge gap where it's hard to talk to one another, is physically write on the tape, the first tape, which side is up. So for this one, I would write top here, so that when they receive the webbing, there's no miscommunication on which webbing goes up. It's very clear to them. I don't have a pen right here, but yeah, it's a good thing to write with a permanent marker or something that won't rub off of the tape which side is up when you're taping your line. So now we can just go through and do random tape spacings between 1 and 1.5 meters. Well, looks like I ran out of tapes before I finished, but that's a good thing. You don't want to overestimate the number of tapes you need, so always try to underestimate so you don't have any extras, which would then just be a waste of tape. So when you're doing your calculations, just subtract 1 or 2 tapes in the beginning, just so you know for sure you won't have any leftovers. So I'd need about 1 more tape here. All right, so I have about 2 meters here left, which is fine, but just keep in mind that when you're working with lines that you plan to leave taped for a while, especially ones with sewn loops on them, this one side that's not the sewn loop side, you're likely going to see the removal and the addition of lots of tapes on the dynamic side. That's because if you plan on using it on different size gaps, a different amount of the line will need to be taped. And so it's good to leave a sizable chunk of the end of your line untaped, just so you lose and have to add the least amount of tapes in the end. But there we go, now we're fully taped, and now you can just take your line and flake it into your bag or coil it, however your preferred method of transportation is. And then, yeah, you're set to Highline. Yeah, so the only thing I can add here is that when you're working with separate pieces of webbing, the whole process is the same aside from the flaking aspect. It's good to flake individually into 2 piles when you have one line for your main and 1 line for your backup, but do it such that when you're feeding it into your taping position that there's no twists coming in. Have the main go to the one side and the backup go to the other, and they're not interacting in a bad way. And also keep track of what's up while you're taping, because you don't want to involuntarily put a main slider somewhere along the length of the line where the rest of the tapes are backup sliders. That could be a disaster for walkability reasons. Yeah, but that pretty much covers everything. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments below. Again, I'm Jerry Mashesky with Balance Community Slackline Outfitters, and make sure you check out the article. There's probably some extra tips in there. Yeah, thanks for watching.